Thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's Wednesday webinar, Are We Really Living in an Infodemic? Deconstructing a Buzzword, featuring Dr. Chico Camargo, a postdoctoral researcher in data science at the OII, and Felix Simon, a Leverhulme doctoral scholar student at the OII. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. Pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time. These will be answered at the end of the talk, and please keep questions as concise as possible. These will be visible to all attendees, and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Chico and Felix.
Well, hello, everyone. I think you see right now in front of you a little poll that we would like you to answer. It's kind of funny to ask you to answer whether we're living in an infodemic, given that the talk is kind of about that. But if in fact, that's the point. An infodemic, or the concept, is something that's sort of appearing everywhere, and people seem to have different opinions and interpretations of it. So we just wanted you to start thinking about it. But we'll get to it right now. Actually, the first half of the talk will be given by Felix. He will sort of bring the topic up and talk about what it is and who are the people talking about this concept, what it means, what it doesn't, and then I'll take the second half talking more about consequences. But I think we'll get to it right now. Felix, the floor is yours.
I shall share my screen. Hang on. All right, I hope everyone can see the slides. So yeah, thanks for coming. And if you've spent just a bit of time on the web in the last couple of months, you will for sure have come across this term infodemic. And perhaps you've also wondered a little what is actually meant by it and why everyone suddenly seems to be using it, and if this is actually really true, if we sort of do live in an infodemic. And well, Chico and I, we sort of had the same questions, and we hope that this talk will provide at least some answers for you. Now, so in essence, what we're going to do over the course of the next 30 minutes or so is to tackle two main questions. The first concerns the usefulness and explanatory power of the term infodemic, or to put it another way, how well does the term actually explain the phenomena it claims to describe? And this will hopefully give us some idea if we are actually living in an infodemic. And the second question is sort of focuses on the use of the term and will be covered by Chico. So why are people using it and what might be the ramifications? But let's get started with a little bit of history. Even though you've probably heard it for the first time this year, the term infodemic is actually not new, but it was coined in 2003 by political analyst David Rothkopf in an essay for the Washington Post. And for him, an infodemic is basically a situation where a few facts mixed with fear, speculations, and rumor, amplified and relayed swiftly worldwide by modern information technologies, affect economies, politics, and security. And while Rothkopf coined it in the context of the then SARS outbreak, he also saw the terms kind of having a wide applicability, for instance, in our response to terrorism, and even to relatively minor occurrences such as shark attacks. And I'm not kidding, he actually says that in his essay. But basically the definition currently in use and sort of swirling around dates back to a situation report published by the World Health Organization, WHO, in February 2020. And it basically says that we sort of see an outbreak and response which has been accompanied by a massive infodemic, which is an overabundance of information, some accurate and some not, and that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And this was sort of reiterated by WHO Director General Ghebreyesus 2 weeks later, where he said, we're not just fighting an infodemic, we're an epidemic, we're also fighting an infodemic. And fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus and is just as dangerous. Funnily enough, after Rothkopf coined the term in 2003, not much actually happened. So despite the prominent birthplace, the term infodemic did not see any widespread uptake in following years. For instance, if you run an exploratory search on Google Trends and you search for infodemic, you can see that sort of search interest for it was mostly absent in the period from 2004 to sort of late 2019. But then rapidly rose after the WHO adopted it in early 2020. And the same is true if you sort of do a basic Google Scholar search for academic articles on the topic. And basically we did that, and we found some 50 entries referencing the term between 2004, when Google Scholar starts, and late 2019. And when I checked last night, we had about 1,900 added just in the space of a year, so from early 2022 now or last night. And a similar trend is also evidenced if you do sort of cursory research for the term infodemic in the archives of various leading international news outlets. So say the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian, Mail Online, etc., where you'd actually be quite hard pressed to find a single article making use of the term or referencing it between 2003 and 2020, but a very sizable amount over the course of this year. And while of course these numbers are not representative, they still provide us with sort of some indication of the general salience of the term and its use in academia as well as the media. Now, what does this coverage and research actually look like? As for the media, they mostly seem to ignore the term's original meaning and instead loosely adhere to the WHO definition. And in the articles we looked at, infodemic is often used to describe coronavirus-related mis and disinformation, its spread, its possible effects, or to frame the responses of technology companies to the same. And with a few notable exceptions, journalists seem to treat the existence of this infodemic as a given, and they've sort of refrained from questioning the term's applicability or its usefulness. And to some extent, the same can be said for the grey literature and recent academic publications. So in many cases, infodemic in this context also used as a shorthand for COVID misinformation exists, and we need to be somewhat worried about it. And most of these studies have used the term to frame their research, for example, diffusion of COVID-19 related information on social media, on online search behavior, or sort of more generally the circulation of misinformation. And others kind of equate the term with the general spread of information, but again, it's sort of, you don't really find an underlying definition or critique of the term, or sort of any probing on what it actually means and what we mean if we sort of talk of infodemics. And this is basically what sort of made Chico and me think about this a bit more, because we kind of felt that this was missing, and this is why we got interested in it and did some research. And basically, we think that infodemics are sort of a flawed concept. So in summary, in the months since the original report, the interest and use of the term and the concept has actually grown quite strongly, with different actors and scientific disciplines using the term, mostly to frame it and sort of to tie their work to what is clearly seen as an important topic. But it also begs the question, is this term actually useful? Does it have any explanatory power? And from this slide, again, you can sort of guess our answer already. And we think that sort of first problem is that the epidemiology metaphor, when it comes to the existence and spread of mis or dis or information more broadly, it might be intuitive, but it's also misleading. And funnily enough, such metaphors are not a new phenomenon. So they have quite a long history. So for instance, if you think of the French polymath Gustave Le Bon, he wrote in 1897 that ideas and beliefs possess a power of contagion as intense as that of microbes. And more recent examples for this, for instance, include Douglas Rushkoff's idea of viral media, which you've probably heard before. The problem is we quickly run actually into issues with such comparisons. So a first problem is the question of origin. While real epidemics have a single well-defined cause, which is the virus whose biological fingerprints we can sequence, which can be identified and traced back to the origins, we cannot actually say the same about information or information abundance. Instead, here we are sort of looking at a multitude of actors who create and disseminate information with various intents, for instance, to inform, but also to do harm. And that's sort of a key difference, because a virus doesn't really have intent, or at least not in the way most of us understand it. Basically, viruses are, and I know it's sort of a discussion in biology, but they are just a collection of molecules that sort of float around and interact with other molecules they run into. But you can't really say that they have any intent in how they behave or what they do and what they cause. A second problem sort of revolves around the idea of information being infectious. And historically speaking, the idea that sort of a susceptible public gets infected with information has been quite popular. And according to this narrative, sort of the public turns into unknowing hosts, and they not only succumb to certain pieces of information, in other words, believe it, but they also unwittingly carry it across to others. But the problem is that such claims not only ignore the cognitive mechanisms of information uptake and sharing, which counter them, but also large body of research that demonstrates that audiences are actually quite active in their decision making and what to consume, what kind of information to believe, and whom to share it with. So again, we sort of have a problem when we sort of equate epidemiological language with information communication. And finally, the third problem is that the infodemic narrative sort of supposes that information spreads like a virus, and unfortunately it doesn't really. So some pieces of information spread in more broadcast-like fashion from one to many, others sort of diffuse more slowly over various people and places. And we all also make active decisions when it comes to sharing information, something that is actually not the case with the genes. So they don't decide if they to spread, they just do. And for an online environment, these social rules actually directly affect how information travels, and these dynamics sort of differ markedly from how germs and viruses disseminate. Now, what about information abundance, sort of the second big part of the WHO definition, and the claim that this sort of makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance? Again, prior research and sort of the emerging evidence we have actually suggests that this claim should be taken with a lot of caution. And despite popular arguments which treat information or news overload as hugely problematic, the literature on the subject is actually a lot more nuanced and often contradicts such simplistic fears. And instead, information abundance is, you could say, actually quite common feature in modern media environments. It's nothing new. We've always had that, at least since the rise of digital media. And while many people, when you sort of ask them in surveys and interviews, while they say that they perceive information overload, researchers actually found that many seem to cope quite well. And we are largely not overwhelmed because we are good at being inattentive or selectively attentive and have developed numerous cognitive strategies to deal with too much information over time. And these findings sort of seem to be borne out by preliminary studies conducted at the height of the pandemic back in the spring of 2020, which kind of seem to suggest that many people actually had a fairly good idea of where to look for reliable information around COVID-19. So respondents in various countries, for instance, stated that the news media have helped them to understand the crisis and the ongoing situation. They also expressed consistently high levels of trust in health experts and scientists. I mean, I know there are exceptions, but sort of on the aggregate level, that seems to have been the case. And they said that these help them to make sense of the situation, so find good and reliable information. And while more research around this will be necessary to fully understand the scale, the shape, and the effect of the information environment during the pandemic, these sort of preliminary and past findings actually make some of the strongest claims around the infodemic at least very questionable. And from this point of view, assertions that firstly, there is an oversupply of information during the current pandemic that differs markedly from normal times, and secondly, that people are not able to navigate any oversupply. So these should be taken with a big pinch of salt. And with that, I hand over to Chico.
Hey, I think someone has to start my video. There we go. Fantastic. Right. So you've seen Felix's side of the talk. You've seen the first part. That was the what. And sure, we now know that the term infodemic, the moment you look closely, it actually doesn't stand on many parts of it. Information doesn't necessarily spread like a virus. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The sort of overload of information, when you look at it, actually people handle it pretty well. So sure, we get that part. But still, a very important question that you might be asking now is, so what? Yeah, yes, sure, it's not a very rigorous term, but isn't it useful to have a term like that so many people can use? And also, isn't it fine to have a term that's, sure, it's an analogy, it's just slightly not too rigorous? Isn't that okay? Well, let's talk about that then. And my first point here, and hopefully you can see my screen. Cool. Let's talk about the power of buzzwords and what they're useful for. Basically, let's see if this works. Right. There's a long story of the use of metaphors, buzzwords, loose concepts in general. Like Felix mentioned, this analogy between contagion, pathogens, and information comes from the 19th century. And language, in fact, has been described by some scholars as a technology, as essentially a tool that we use to share ideas. What we're doing right now, I'm using terms that you recognize so I can share these ideas with you. And in that sense, it makes sense that words that are a bit loose, like infodemic, will be sort of like trading zones. These buzzwords will be places where academics, journalists, policymakers can just converge to discuss these topics, exchange ideas, and just come up with solutions. So you will find, like the WHO Infodemic Conference, where you will find public health policymakers talking with computer scientists and mathematical modelers and epidemiologists, journalists. It's great. It's great to have these physical sort of trading zones of ideas that are basically happening because of a buzzword. So that's a good thing. And infodemics is a very useful word in that respect. It draws in a lot of people that have interest in roughly the same things. And it's a powerful word because it draws from many things that we understand or for which we have a good intuition. The moment you put the word demic, it makes people think of an epidemic, of a pandemic. I get it. It's a powerful word, but that's a problem. Today, if you look at, for instance, scientists, like as exemplified here by this tweet, well, a lot of scientists are seemingly just transitioning their research to what could be described as COVID research. These buzzwords, they sort of come in waves, and much like you had a big wave of AIDS, any science would be, we want to do this because AIDS, we're going to solve AIDS. Then there came a wave of we're going to solve cancer. Around 2001, suddenly it was because terrorism, and now it's because COVID. It sounds like a joke, but actually this has a serious effect on what kind of science gets funded and what kind of policies get people's attention and what kind of experts get attention. Around 2001, if you happen to be a terrorist expert, you were the most important person in the room. And if you happen to do anything that remotely related to terrorism, for sure gonna call it terrorism. It's understandable that people do that because researchers are trying to adapt, are trying to kind of hop onto the bandwagon and just get a slice of that pie. So you end up with many people whose work is not that related to whatever the original meaning of the word was, but that are there anyway. And this doesn't mean that their work is bad. I think that's something important here. We're not in this talk trying to say that if you use infodemic as a term, your work is terrible. No. It's more like the opposite. It doesn't mean a thing. Using the word infodemic, if everyone is using it and you can't really tell exactly what it is about, maybe your work is very good, maybe your work is unrelated, but everyone will be there. And that's what's happening with COVID right now. And I'm just pointing it out as something that does happen. It's part of the, I'll call it ecosystem of buzzwords and academia and journalists and writers. Anyone that is an expert of sorts today will be valued if they're an expert on the topic of the day. And the topic of the day right now is COVID. And well, around, I think, 1956, Claude Shannon made that point about information theory. He said that many people were using the term that he decided to use to describe something coming from mathematics, of radio communication. Many people were using that to talk about biology and physics, psychology, economics. It just became a very broad term. And Shannon, in this paper, literally called the bandwagon, was just claiming for rigor. He was saying, everyone, please slow down, be rigorous, and stop jumping on the bandwagon. He said that he'd rather not have people using his information theory to describe things like biology or economics. And he'd rather people be a bit more conservative and rigorous and do slow work. What we have here on the screen is, well, really pointing out that he'd rather have a few good papers than many mediocre ones that are just hopping onto the bandwagon, which at the time was information theory, and using the word information to describe a lot of things that were already being described. But that's the thing. The problem here is not just academic. And let me illustrate that using the notion of cybersecurity. This will be drawing from a work of a OII alumna, Yuyas Lupsca. Maybe she's watching the talk, I don't know. But this, in her paper, she discussed what was the best metaphor for cybersecurity. Well, is it a cyber war? Is it an online cyber ecosystem? Is it an architecture of sorts? Is it something else, maybe a kind of health metaphor? And the thing is, historically, different metaphors guide different policies, different laws, different solutions. So when you talk about cyber war, that is really emphasizing the conflict between perhaps countries, between agents. When you talk about an ecosystem, it kind of sounds like there's a predator and a prey and someone's killing someone, but it's all about trying to bring this ecosystem to harmony. Whereas if you talk about cyber architecture, this really emphasizes the cooperative aspect of it, how we need to build infrastructure that benefits everyone. And the truth is, cybersecurity is all of the above. It's neither, like, these are metaphors, they're tools that we use, like the buzzwords that I mentioned. Now, if you bring the same reasoning to information, well, what do we have then? Is it a misinformation epidemic, or can you be sort of vaccinated? And is it an ecosystem? Is it a war? These different metaphors, they carry implicit associations that are different from each other. The biological metaphors, they suggest, as Felix mentioned, that information spreads on its own and kind of erases the agency of the person spreading it. Whereas these warfare metaphors, they emphasize the political aspects, the use and misuse of information as a weapon. The health metaphors, they're interesting because they suggest a clear good and bad. There's healthy and unhealthy. And they suggest it's something you should be able to control, you should be able to treat, perhaps with a single solution, like a vaccine for misinformation. There are theories called inoculation theories that talk about inoculating a belief in a person. So when you think of it as vaccines, health, and inoculation, you will be sort of framing your thoughts and carrying these implicit associations with you. It's important to have that in mind because any metaphor will carry some of those. And some competitive metaphors, well, they will be more warlike. Some cooperative metaphors, they might a bit de-emphasize the war aspect. And there's the thing, governments know that different metaphors can allow for different policies. Think of all the dehumanizing metaphors where immigrants are called rats or aliens, or where presidents might say things like drain the swamp. That will associate different nationalities with different concepts like dirt or contamination. That is something that we see historically. And to bring it to something more contemporary, for instance, in the UK, around the end of 2019, if you looked at what politicians were saying in the UK Parliament, they had different topics every day. And then came COVID, and the Secretary of Health and the pandemic took the scene. They all just spoke about the consequences for the British health system. Makes sense. But then now, well, from the, say, May this year, since that time, COVID is still in the agenda, but the old topics are coming back with a twist. Now, the example here is Priti Patel saying, we want, Brexit, we want to end free movement because COVID, because we need a strong country because COVID. And remember the because terrorism I was mentioning. That's what's happening here. You're having more countries using COVID, and sometimes not just COVID, but also fake news and misinformation, and possibly the infodemic too, as a justification for whatever they want to do. And see, that's the order of operation. They use that fear, in a sense, or that concept, that metaphor, as a justification for whatever they want to do, whether that's a positive or bad thing, whether that's something in their interests, basically. And it's not just the UK. If we have, for instance, in Mexico, the president, he tried to pass a law that would essentially concentrate more power in the hands of the president by allowing him to approve budgets without having to confirm with the equivalent of the parliament there. We also had in Hungary the Anti-Coronavirus Act, quote unquote, that was to give power to, again, Orban there to basically have his own police and arrest people on charges of disseminating false information because of COVID. And you see how it works. If you have something that is a national threat, then that is a good excuse for politicians to try to concentrate more power in their hands. And that's the moment when a metaphor that you're using just because it's convenient might fall in the wrong hands. That is, I would say, the biggest danger of metaphors, that they have a much, much wider impact than just some academic or journalist that's trying to find a catchy term for something. In fact, to date, like, I'm not imagining, I said possibly, but actually there's evidence that 18 governments at least have added such countermeasures in response to the infodemic. And that's sort of a problem because many of these disinformation countermeasures are actually not tested. They're not based on evidence. They're based on educated guesses and intuition based on what sounds about right. So giving the government the power to arrest people who are spreading fake news, that sounds sensible until the moment you realize that no one has the power to define what it is fake or not, like who's got that power. That sort of guess quick based policy is a very dangerous kind of policy because it's something that can outlast the pandemic. The moment COVID-19 goes away, how many of these laws are going to stay? When is it a good time for politicians to say, right, the threat of fake news has gone away? Are people going to actually want to let go of that power? That happened in Hungary. The parliament managed to remove those powers from Viktor Orban, but it doesn't mean it'll happen in every country. So really, the final point of our talk here is, what do we do? Really, what can we do now? Felix and I have criticized this word a lot, but what? Are we just telling you this word is bad and that's it? Well, there's a few things. First, let's make it clear, this is an intuitive and appealing concept, but it's also equally misleading and inaccurate. It makes us wonder whether it's a useful term at all if it has so many bad consequences. And I'd like to remind you that a new term can be like a territorial claim, a way to say, this is my turf, I'm an expert on this topic, even though until 2020, literally no one was using the word infodemic. Now we have many people who claim to be experts on that. And I'm not saying they're not experts on anything. They are surely experts on something that had a different name. And what we are arguing here is that really we must embrace caution and rigor. Rather than using infodemic, we are asking researchers to use a more accurate term, use more accurate terminology. If you're studying, for instance, high choice media environments, go with that. Propaganda, sure, misinformation, whatever. Use the terms that accurately describe what you're doing. And for people looking at that research and reading experts, I'd say also watch out for the old wine in new bottles. What we're saying here is, it's interesting to sound innovative. It would be a bit like if Felix and I decided to create the field of infocritics for the critical analysis of information phenomena. Like, why do you need a name for that? Who gains by using that name? Who's going to use that name and what for? That's why we're saying, please slow down and embrace rigor, embrace caution, because metaphors have power over our policies, over our laws, our decisions. So yeah, let's keep watching, let's pay attention. That's what we had for today. Thank you so much. Laura Isabel.
Right, I think this is the time for the Q&A. So if people have questions, we will try to answer them as good as possible. And if not, you can always send us emails and pester us with more questions afterwards.
Right. So we've got here a first question from Muto asking, she says she was not aware of end-time misinformation policies in the view of COVID. Could you please explain a bit more what these policies involve? In principle, I think that end-time misinformation policies should be in place, but of course, this depends on what these policies involve. Before we answer that, I'll just say, if you have any questions, just go to the Q&A tab and we'll try to go over all of them. Felix, do you want to have a go at this one?
I can, but probably you should follow it up because you sort of look more at that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I think generally sort of what we've seen with many of these is that they sort of try to police speech in the broader sense of the term. So for instance, there have been cases where governments try to regulate what kind of information should be able to spread and what kind of information is seen as harmful. And they've crafted, in some cases, sort of on the go policies and laws responding to that, and sort of trying to get that under control. And again, this is sort of nothing new. If you think of my own home country, Germany, we've had something called a Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, beautiful long word, which to some extent basically does that. It sort of forces social media, sort of intermediaries, social media platforms to police content to some extent in accordance with the German law. And in some sense, you could say that a lot of what we see in sort of quick responses to the infodemic is kind of the same, just in different ways, and often not as fully fleshed out as maybe the German law was at the time, and people sort of still thinking with that.
That's it.
My response.
Yeah, most misinformation policies are not exclusive for COVID, but they use COVID as a sort of a trampoline, as a motivation to then pass on laws like the Anti-Coronavirus Act, which we mentioned. That was not exclusive for COVID misinformation, but it was the justification to then move on to that. There are multiple countries discussing sort of internet regulation and fake news laws, broadly speaking, and having very active discussions of what that is. And well, it is the case that many of them are sort of moving towards giving someone power to basically remove things from the internet. And it's always that question of who's deciding what counts and what doesn't. And usually the person making that call is also the person that gets to delete the post. So the person gets to be the judge and the executioner, essentially, which is, as we've described, quite concerning because, well, the pandemic is going to go away and lies have always existed. So how do you tread this line between having rules for speech online, for instance, dealing with hate speech and things like that, while not making explicit censorship? That's why we're just asking people to slow down and be careful.
Cool. The next question is, how methods did you use to analyze news policies to determine buzzwords trends? Chico, would you like to start on that? I mean, I think you can answer that briefly.
Absolutely. So first we obviously started with just Googling around and seeing, like what Felix mentioned, how many articles do you find over time? But then we also moved on to looking at, now the name escapes me, I think Scopus, to just see articles including certain terms like infodem and infodemic. And we've also looked at the archives of newspapers, also looked at Google Trends to just see things, whether the term itself was going up and down. I think the most useful sources for us were Google Scholar, and then kind of tracking the abstracts of papers using these words, and the archives of newspapers to see how often the term was not being used at all.
Right. Okay. Next question. Where did it go? Current counter policies are based on educated guesses because research on the effects of disinformation are still limited. What are the future prospects in this regard? Can we expect impactful research on this? I think I can start with this one if you like. Sure. Thanks, Sophie, for the question. I think generally, I mean, we see a lot of research being done in Europe, in the US, and sort of Asia and the global South on the effects of misinformation. So it's mis and disinformation. So it is forthcoming, and a lot of really, really smart people, many of them at Oxford University and other places, are working on this. The problem actually is that there's sort of, to some extent, some disconnect still between research and policy. And even though we try to do good research and sort of bring the most sophisticated methods into the field to study these questions, it doesn't automatically mean that the politicians will actually listen to us and sort of take notice of our research, and especially if it says, oh, well, actually, you probably worry a bit too much about the effects of mis and disinformation, and there's also quite legitimate risk to say freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of speech that comes along with regulating these things. So I think that sort of would be my response. I mean, there is research, but there's also still some gap between research and policy. And of course, there are also cases where policymakers just don't care. I mean, you could give them the best research and they would have sort of their invested interests when it comes to ignoring it and just doing what they personally would like to do.
Yeah. I'm going to take here a question by Joshua asking about our concern about infodemic, but also other terms like fake news and post-truth. I think all of these, I'd say they suffer from the same illness, if we're not tired of talking about illnesses here in this talk. The term post-truth is a very attractive term, it's very appealing, but it frankly makes people ask, what did we have before? And I know Felix can have a lot to say about this, but some people have argued that perhaps we are in a post-trust society, or perhaps actually there is no significant transition. It's just the emergence of a term to point out at a collection of phenomena, and we are not in a position where we can just draw a line and say, obviously we are in a new era. When did that start? That's the moment when, if you go into if you try to be more rigorous about the term, some of these terms, they get a bit diffuse. Fake news, I think, is the clearest one of them all. Like what counts as fake news? If someone lies on the internet, if I say I had this thing for breakfast today and I did not, is that fake news? No, that's just someone saying something stupid. So if you try to sort of draw a little boundary around what counts as fake and news, there's a lot of things that are harmful, dangerous, weaponized that don't fall into that boundary. There's a lot of information that's out of context and that's correct, but just used basically to hurt someone's reputation, for instance. There's a lot of content that is very partisan, that is closer to junk food if you were to think of nutrition and value. It's just information that's not used for anything. There's one of the groups here at the OII that talks about junk news in that sense. But anyway, the point is, the term infodemic in this talk we showed that is something that if you try to analyze it in detail, every part starts sort of breaking down. And in my opinion, the same happens with fake news, post-truth. And that is, I'm not saying we should just abandon all words. It's not that. But it's being mindful of what we say and not just using them because everyone else is. Now, Felix, I don't know if you want to complement that.
No, I think you captured it beautifully. And given the time and many questions, we should probably move to the next one. And I think that's currently Andy at the top, who asked, where does this end? Where I said there's little evidence, little incentive for academics to act as public intellectual, critical versus be a thought leader, in brackets cheerleading. How can funders or organizations dehype these neologisms? Well, that's a good question. Do you have any idea, Chico? What would you say?
I think Andy is spot on there. If you have for instance, a funding call, the WHO is going to fund research on infodemics. What do? Because if you, as a scientist, a researcher, you want to do good research, shouldn't you then hop on the bandwagon? It's a tricky thing. I think really the best way is to bring these people into the conversation and to not just have an OII seminar where we only invite OII people and only the OII people will know that infodemic is a bad word. That, I think, won't work. We really need to bring these people in to use their power as funders, as these kind of large organizations, to direct our efforts in ways that can work. Since they do have the power to bring so many specialists together, great, let's keep on doing that. I feel like we're not so far from a regime, from a situation where we can actually get people around concepts that actually work, rather than make people stop at the buzz. Feels like we're not that far from it. But yes, it definitely requires bringing them into the conversation, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's not much else to say to that, at least from my moment. Right, Chico, do you want to pick the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take the first one here. No way topical, but there are many politicians, groups that benefit from spreading misinformation and confusion overall. And how do you approach dealing with that? I think there's who's going to approach them is so diverse that people can have quite different strategies. I feel that at I'm going to start at the family level. You know, if I'm in the WhatsApp group with my family members, I can, with them, just try to make sure that we don't spread anything without thinking about it. We don't just tell people that 5G is causing people to have COVID because someone told me so, things like that. But in a much higher level of people who benefit from this, just the spread of confusion, I think that it's important to be strategic. Sharing, for instance, sharing a tweet with ways to handle misinformation won't change the fact that some groups do benefit from spreading it. So I think the regulatory side can be very effective. For instance, regulating, WhatsApp has tried limiting the number of shares that a certain message can get. Things like that should be studied, should be investigated to be useful. Laws about like trying to identify, bot accounts, or trying to basically cut the power of the people spreading misinformation. And I think right now, having, for instance, the American election, we all appreciate the importance of the online spread of information and how that can have so many unpredictable impacts, and how it's easy to hype that as well. Just say, oh yeah, internet, lies on the internet are going to make everything change. Whoa, we need to watch it closer. We need to regulate these things more to make sure power is not concentrated in the hands of simply who has money to buy more fake accounts, things like that. I think it's not going to be a one solution for all of this, because this is quite a systemic problem, I think.
I think I would briefly add to that. I mean, it's also a question you can approach from sort of institutional point of view, and one of the best ways to, well, not to stop, but to sort of to keep politicians and groups that benefit from spreading misinformation and confusion in check is to have strong institutions that push against this. And that could be, for instance, experts, public health organizations, generally institutions which are concerned with the public and value and service for the public. Journalism, a free press that holds these elites and leaders accountable is also certainly part of the solution. And of course, this depends on the country context, and this might be easier to introduce or to bolster and emphasize in some countries than others. So we see, for instance, when you look at the US at the moment, it's a seemingly very polarized country. There's many problems with sort of institutions and lack of trust in institutions, and there's no quick fix for these sort of long-standing structural problems. But in societies where you still have institutions which have some power, which are trusted, and many European institutions, but also many other countries around the world are a good example of that. Of course, you would want to strengthen them rather than taking away from sort of the trust they have and the sort of the position they enjoy in society in terms of providing reliable information and countering false claims.
I couldn't say it better. Yeah. I'm going to move on to Hannah's question here. Is Infodemic ever used in a positive way? It feels like there's some balance between where information is good for pandemics, like updates to Wikipedia pages and daily statistics. That's good. And at what point does that become perhaps too much information? Or could we maybe reclaim Infodemic as not just waves of misinformation, but maybe the positive provision of useful misinformation? Felix, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, it's a really broad question. I'm not sure. I personally, I would, and sort of in line with our talk, I would actually advocate against using Infodemic at all, because I just think it's just not really good in terms of capturing many underlying phenomena which are sort of lumped together and then explained in some sense with this term. And also question if there can ever be something like too much information. I mean, this is what's the baseline, and where sort of do you say, okay, this is the threshold, and after that it's just too much and we can't handle it. And if you sort of go back through history, this has always been a concern of humans, and it's nothing new. But sort of speaking with research findings from cognitive sciences, communication, etc. Again, we are quite good at dealing with this and sort of finding our way through. We have various heuristics, and these days we also have technology to some extent that helps us, say algorithms, for instance. So the question is there actually something like too much information? I'm not sure if that's sort of, really helpful to think about in this context. And let me just see if I have left anything unaddressed. No, Chico, do you have anything to add to that? I think.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. I guess one thing I want to emphasize is that the term infodemic has been used in many good works of people who have been monitoring for instance, the widespread of unreliable content or of information that is inaccurate and that can cause serious harm. People drinking cleaning products to cure a disease, whatever. I've seen, and we've even mentioned when in our slides, some works that do use the term infodemic, and they do work. And if any question raised to that work should be raised by the specialists in the field, by the peer reviewers and all that. But I strongly agree with what Felix said. The term is just lumping them all into one. So when, like in some of the papers we looked at, when you have the same term, infodemic, being used to describe people feeling anxious because there's too much something, and wrong information on the internet about COVID-19, when you have that, this sort of dilutes the use and the power of that term. It just becomes a catch-all term for anything that feels useful at the moment. It feels like a massive bandwagon. So I don't think there is any good situation that is really captured by the notion of an infodemic, because we kind of had terms for that did a better job. And the simple like viral spread of information, isn't that essentially an infodemic? We had that before, and that term has its own issues. I think the word itself could be dropped and nothing would change. If anything, it would be better, because then you could have people actually using the words they mean. And I'm not saying we can just drop it from a day to another and have nothing to replace it. As we said in the talk, there are better terms for every situation. And it's important to have these trading zones where people do bring in different insights about the same topic. That is important. But it's important to go beyond the hype, beyond just saying, great, we're all talking about infodemics and no one's going to define it because we don't have to.
Okay, next question. Do you really think that appeal on being more cautious and conservative is feasible in current fast information sharing climate? Shouldn't there be more focus on what to do when the term is taking over and enables politics? I think it's not a question of feasibility. I think it's the only thing we can do, really. We have to be cautious and conservative and push for that regardless of the outcome. So even if it doesn't lead to much, it's I think our duty to as researchers and generally as policymakers, journalists, as members of the public, not to sort of get carried away with simplistic terms that have lots of baggage and potentially problematic implications. And so when it comes to the focus on what to do when a term is taking over and enables politics, again, it depends on your position within sort of the wider system and what you can do. If you are just a normal member of the public, well, one thing you can do is stop using it yourself in conversation with friends and family. But again, if you are a journalist, for instance, you could actually say, okay, I'm not going to use it for the headline, even though it will drive the sort of search engine optimization through the roof and will get me lots of clicks and views on the article I'm writing. And the same for the academic, even if, yes, writing a paper on the infodemic and sort of having it prominently in your headline will probably mean that more people will read it, and hopefully you'll get more research funding after, etc. pp. You could sort of hold back and think for a moment, is it really sort of a service that I'm doing here to society at large and to other people? So again, it sort of depends on your position and who you are in terms of what you can do, and there's no sort of unified coherent approach that we could take, and it sort of depends on each and every one of us to sort of stop this term actually from taking over and enabling at times quite horrendous politics.
Exactly. We've got so many good questions. I had to pick one here. Why do we consider it? Oh, wait, it disappeared. Why do we consider it a bandwagon and not just, knowledge being constructed collectively? That's how knowledge usually goes, and you need more people to unpack and enhance and change the meaning of a term. It is important to define the contour of a term after a while of its use, sure. And the question keeps disappearing. There we go. But after enough knowledge becomes available about different possible aspects of it, maybe it's too early at this point for infodemic. What do you think? I think that's a really good question. And who's to say that these two people here talking to a camera have the right to say, don't use this term or do use it? I think, yes, it is a collective construction. And this is part of bringing a voice to the construction, saying, right, if we are going to have a word, if we are going to use a new word, let's make sure it is useful. Let's make sure it doesn't disenfranchise people who already don't have a lot of power. And let's make sure that if we are going to make up a new word, that it perhaps brings explanatory power to the scientists, that it brings a good sort of summary power to journalists, but that it doesn't become a weapon for totalitarian governments to just say, aha, see, the academics say there's an epidemic going on, so now please give me all the police power so I can shut down all the misinformation. Like, I think, yes, knowledge is a collective construction. And that is the moment when we need to shape it, when we need to decide where this is going to go. I mentioned the old wine in new bottles because every so often there will be another scholar who says, hey, I have a new term. And when you sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you think about it, the term is just referring to old ideas, and that could cause no harm. If no one uses it, for instance, sure, no harm caused. But if that term can be, which is the case here, can be weaponized so much, then we shouldn't wait for it to be weaponized to then decide that it was a bad idea, to then decide that this term was a bad idea. Felix, I don't know if you had something else to add here.
No, I think you said it all, really.
Cool. But yeah, very good question.
Okay, do you want to pick the next one?
Sure. I think the next one that appears here on top of my screen is absolutely connected to that, whether any language is actually value-free. If it's realistic to expect political leaders or leaders of any kind to not use language as a tool to push what they want to do. And it's kind of like, how can you expect life to go on without that? Yeah, I don't think it can. I don't think we can pretend to believe that there will be a world where only objective terms are used and there are no subjective imposed values on things. And yeah, I think it's more of a constant struggle. And I'm using that to avoid saying battle, because if I say battle, it sounds like there's the good guys and the bad guys. It's just a constant struggle in this collective construction of knowledge through values. The moment you have a word that is heavy and that can have serious implications for power, for policy, then all stakes are high. And the use, for instance, the UK had recently politicians talking about critical race studies, I think that was it. And there we go. Now you have a term that it's being used politically, not just used in a classroom or in a book, but now used to represent things that perhaps the academics using that term didn't quite mean. And this sort of shifting of meaning, it's done in every sphere. It's used by people to empower themselves and take a term that's used as derogatory to try to say, no, when I say it, I don't mean that. I don't mean to dehumanize myself. I'm using this term to empower myself. All that battle, and I'm no expert on it, all that battle is something that we cannot avoid. That is how it goes. Symbols, power, language, those things are constantly in battles and struggles. And I think that we here are not trying to say, please, politicians, stop using loaded words. Rather, it's, please, everyone else, look at how words can be loaded, and let's just be more careful, more rigorous. Let's slow down and pay attention.
Brilliantly said. Let's jump to the next one, so we might get some more answered in the time remaining. On the use of the term, I found myself using it in quotation marks for recent publication to give the broader context of the piece on the need for critical literacy education. That's implicit that we need to be careful, and I would love to be able to add an additional footnote now. Yeah, again, I mean, the problem with the term to some extent, it's so salient and so widely used by now. It's quite hard to not to avoid and steer around it. And I think generally it's fine if especially if it's used in quotation marks and if it's sort of critically addressed and if you sort of generally make reference to the existence of this discussion around, say, infodemic or fake news. I mean, fake news is equally loaded in many ways, but I think it's sort of just for future publications. I would personally try not to use this, and sort of be more precise, but if it sort of generally addresses the fact that there is a debate and that people are currently having concerns about spread of information, spread of code-related information, misinformation, etc. I think then in this context, if it's sort of properly referenced and contextualized, I think that's fine, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, totally agree. Let's just take, I'm going to take here Jake's question. So he's interested in the point about how these buzzwords sort of bring disparate fields together for productive study. Yes, totally does. And it feels like even the fields that are coming in, they often struggle to define themselves. You know, critical infrastructure studies versus critical platform studies or critical data studies, or maybe remove a word and put another one. What are the benefits and drawbacks for these disciplines and institutions in such a plural and pluralization of fields situation? I think that personally, I find that to be a fascinating thing that is constantly happening, because the more interdisciplinary things you get, the more you get people trying to define themselves. Just to pick a few examples, I know, for instance, that in biophysics, which to an outsider sounds like biology and physics coming together, actually we'll find some biophysicists that will say that their kind of biophysics is biophysics and what the other people do is physical biology. And I just love that example, because to an outsider, it sounds like the same thing. But the moment you talk about regulatory bodies, funding agencies, conferences, and whoever's got the money to fund more research, then name, identity, brands, those things matter a lot. Nanotechnology has gone through one of those. Cryonics and cryogenics has gone through one of those as well, with sort of a few important researchers just concentrating the name around what the kind of work they do. And that's something that could happen to any kind of field. Basically, if say that Felix and I are two big professors, but we disagree about something important, but Felix gets the term infodemic, for instance, to be his kind of research, then suddenly what is what I'm doing? If it's not that, then I'm sort of academically homeless, or what? There is this sort of power dynamic there too. There are some fields that really succeeded in doing so. One big example is the case of molecular biology, which today is something you see in a lot of biology programs and things like that. But when it emerged, it was nothing more than just a lot of academics from different areas coming together, and they really came from very separate areas until someone asked, what are you? And one of them, a person said, we're molecular biologists. And that, I don't know the full history, but that caught on and it became a thing. And I'm sure that someone could start asking, like, is it really molecular? Is it really biology? And the same could be brought to every new brand of a thing. Brands are obviously very useful. They are a way to draw attention to you, to say, look, the thing I'm studying is important and it's innovative. It might just be a new label to an old one. But yeah, constant fight, super interesting.
It's a beautiful closing speech. Then I think we unfortunately have to end it here because we are at the end of our session. Yeah, thanks so much to all of you for attending and for all these great and brilliant questions. Something really hard actually to answer. And yeah, take care, be safe, and we'll see you soon on the internet, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chico and Felix, for a fascinating insight today. Thank you all for attending. You will receive a follow-up email in due course. Next week, Professor Philip Howard is hosting Professor Lisa Nakamura discussing understanding digital racism after COVID-19 on Wednesday, the 11th of November at 5:30 p.m. UK time. Please visit the events page on the OII website to sign up. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.